Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. I want to welcome you to the second day of our Powertrain Strategies for the 21st Century Conference. Let's get into some of the research. Here we're looking at the 2021 Powertrain Strategies for the 21st Century survey. We've been doing this for a number of years. First of all, we always want to thank our sponsors who are our affiliates. Again, thank you for all the support that you give us, not only for our research project, but for our conferences. We couldn't do it without you. It's a survey of powertrain experts and from automotive manufacturers, suppliers, government, NGOs, academia, and consulting. And we are asking for their predictions for 2025 to 2030. Follows are similar surveys that we've been doing since back in 2006. And these surveys were completed June and July of this year. We had about 73 respondents participate in the survey, 25% manufacturers, 35% manufacturers, and 40% from the other group of academics, government, NGOs, and consultants. Most of our responses for this survey are based on means on average answers, but all the responses are weighted by the respondents' confidence in their response. So we ask them after each section how confident they are of the responses, and that is used as the weight variable to weight their answers. Looking at the hybrids and the EV story for electric vehicles, we looked at the differences between what we received last year here at the significant increase in electric vehicles and hybrids compared to last year for past cars. For trucks, it was much more very similar on hybrids from what we received last year. Electrics, significant increase compared to what we saw the year before. For corporate average fuel economy and emissions, experts think it's relatively likely that there'll be similar CAFE regulations than what we had for the Biden administration as we saw for the Obama administration, though some people think we'll be focusing more on what California negotiated with the prior administration. They're expecting that they will meet manufacturers will meet their CAFE requirements in 2026, but with credits and without credits. It's a little different from last year, though, where they expected more would do it without credits, and also would not more in this year said they would not meet their CAFE goals. When you look at increases in fuel economy between 21 and 26, 11% we're expecting to be the cumulative fuel economy increase during that time, and 12% from last year. Some states are requiring that manufacturers produce a certain amount of zero-emission vehicles. Experts find it unlikely that these goals will be met by 2030, maybe possible by 2035, and that it's likely that they'll be able to meet these goals by 2040. All right, EV expectations. Experts believe it'll be over a decade before the price of EVs will be equal to ICE cars without government or industry incentives. 2034. If we looked at that last year, this was 2033. We separated it this year between vehicles without government incentives, 2034. With government incentives, they're expecting it to happen by 2028. When we look at lithium-ion batteries reaching the 100 kilowatt per hour, they're expecting this around 2030 or sooner. So that's meeting a goal. I think last year they were expecting this to take a little longer. Experts are split if battery supply will be able to keep up with the demand for BEVs within the 2025, 2030 timeframe. Very significant split between the two groups. Experts believe it's likely that manufacturers will be able to acquire the necessary talent for in-house battery R&D by 2030. This is something that we think is an important issue, especially as we make this transition to electric vehicles. In terms of EV charging, the idea of manufacturers creating charging stations by 2030 was disputed by experts. Some didn't see that it was kind of like it was a maybe, some were likely, some were unlikely. It kind of shows you the split that whether the manufacturers will get into, and we're not necessarily talking about proprietary charging stations such as the superchargers for Tesla, but just getting involved in charging. We see that GM has been doing some work on this. I think Ford has as well, and starting to reach out and support more charging stations. Experts believe that it's somewhat likely that the goal of 500,000 charging stations will be met by 2030. It's a little tricky because when you look at where other countries are in terms of charging stations, China right now is at about, and here you're talking about outlets, they're talking about, they have about almost 2 million chargers on the road right now, available right now. That's home and public. When you look at what we also asked about what might be future needed, and experts are thinking that we're going to need many more than 500,000 charging stations. The importance of charge planning capabilities. Here you're talking about charger mapping or charger reservations. That's particularly high, and we think it's going to be crucial for EVs to have continued growth. And experts believe that it's somewhat likely that the U.S. power grid will be able to keep up with the demand for EVs. Pretty much they're in the positive range here. We heard from Kelsey Peterson from DTE yesterday, who said we thought he was pretty possible and in pretty good shape in terms of getting the grid ready for the high demand that EVs will bring to it. And finally, the experts think it will be difficult for non-homeowners to charge their EVs in 2025, and still it will still be somewhat of an issue by 2030. So this is something that we talked about also yesterday with some of the issues related to multifamily dwelling units, apartments throughout the U.S. Though the U.S. is a very high single family dwelling unit country, 75 to 80%. There's still, when you look at the future of EVs, especially when you start looking at used vehicles, used EVs down the road, and people who are living in apartments probably don't have as much money. They're probably driving used vehicles. They're going to need to charge their vehicles. So it's something that's going to be an issue going forward. Our first speaker of the day, Amaya Joshi from Corning. He's the Director of Emerging Technology and Regulations at Corning, and we welcome him. Thank you, Amaya.
Thank you, Bruce. So I'll start sharing my presentation. Let me know if you see it okay. It's in full screen mode. Is it still okay?
And we're ready to go.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much, and I will start timing myself so I don't run over. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Amaya Joshi. I work with Corning, and we make after-treatment systems for emissions control from internal combustion engines. So that gives you a quick flavor of what to expect from me, right? Which is our businesses related to emissions control, and electrification is clearly going to be very disruptive. but we are embracing it. I think it's the right thing. Electrification is cool. It is going to solve a lot of problems. But the flavor of the talk today is I want to give sort of our view on, or at least my view on how we see the various forces shaping the rate at which it proceeds, which is obviously very, very important for us, right? So take it with that sort of lens. So when Bruce invited me to present, I jumped at the opportunity because it sort of helps me pull together a lot of thinking that I've been doing in this area. So my contact information is on here. Please feel free to reach out even after this event. So I recently read this book from Clayton Christensen on disruptive innovations, and EVs are clearly one. And I realized something, which is that, you know, very often we have these debates about, you know, whether and how electrification should proceed, and I think it's the one of the core issues is that we are always looking at electrification from one angle, like let's say the consumer or the OEM or what the government should be doing, and each of these entities is actually trying to do something different. And Clayton says that, you know, it's what is the job that we want a particular product to perform is what we should look at it as, and that's what I'm trying to collect here, or collect the thoughts here. So one is, for example, you know, policymakers are looking at EVs to solve a certain type of problem, and that's, you know, as we know, global warming, so reduce CO2, reduce urban pollution, NOx and particulates, and then other considerations listed here, right? I mean, can we, you know, get rid of fossil fuel use or reduce it anyway, or can we enhance our technology leadership in a certain area, make use of materials that are locally available, and so on, right? So there's a lot of sort of thinking that's going on from a policy making perspective. Consumers, and you heard a lot about it yesterday from Consumer Reports, but clearly they're looking at this, you know, instant torque that you get, and it's fun to drive an EV. Some want to also be environmentally sound, and they love that they're driving a cleaner vehicle, lower cost of ownership, heavy duty, I would say, especially so, because if you can save a ton of money over the life of a truck, that is a pretty good deal. OEMs are obviously trying to make a profit on the products that they sell, and what they don't want is being fined for missing CO2. So they're looking at EVs as another tool at meeting the CO2 norms, right? So that's a very different way of looking at it. And then finally, investors, right? I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, you know, this is an area of growth, and investors are looking for a return on their investment, and there's a lot of money that's freely flowing into electrification now. So again, we are looking at this from all different angles, and I just want to, you know, keep this framework in mind as you look at what I'm going to present, which is that, again, this is a very sort of complex issue, but we are looking at it from different angles. And I'm not going to be talking about consumers and investors. Clearly, consumers has been covered yesterday. Investors, I don't need to say much. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but I will talk about it from a policymaker and OEM perspective, right? So starting with policymakers, okay, so how do you drive electrification, right? What are the regulatory tools that are being used? Clearly, the first and the most direct one is electrification targets, right? So there's, and again, we've discussed this a little bit already, you know, there's many countries are already announcing IC bans and electrification targets driven through incentives and you know, carbon tax. I think just today, again, the European Union has announced their new targets for the overall economy, not just the transportation, to reach a CO2 neutrality. CO2 fuel economy standards are the next one, which are, I would say, slightly less indirectly affecting electrification, right? So again, the EU setting 37.5% reduction through this decade, but I think by tomorrow we'll know that this may be, you know, already an older target, and we'll go even steeper. And keep in mind that these targets are with the backdrop of ICs pretty much remaining flat in terms of the CO2 improvements year over year for the past 3 or 4 years. So these are very, very tight targets, and also US, of course, we'll see newer targets moving further and beyond 2026. So all of these CO2 requirements are, you know, will be met through electric vehicles or hybrids increasing in volume as well, right? So that's another. By the way, whenever I see EV here, I mean a pure electric vehicle and fuel cell vehicle, and electrification, however, would include also hybrids, plug-in hybrids, mild hybrids, what have you, right? So just that sort of, and then the last one is the most indirect, and which is criteria pollutant standards, right? Which is reducing particle mass or number from emissions from the tailpipe and hydrocarbons NOx, right? Which is shown on the y-axis here. And just to put this in context, right? We started here in 2000 for tier 1 in the US, and we're talking about tier 4 now, and that would be our level 4 in California, and that would be in this little rectangle. So modern ICs are incredibly clean actually, and they are, but they're being forced into this little corner, and I think actually that it is this last one which is actually the most sort of indirect one, which is also forcing OEMs to take a hard look at how much spending should we put, how much investment should we put on solving this last problem versus shifting towards EVs, because we are anyway have to meet the CO2 standards, right? So these are the various tools that are being looked into. Now, taking California as an example, right? Because California is sort of leading both the electrification and criteria pollutants in the US. This was from one of their recent workshops, and they showed, here's the green is the sort of the ZEV uptake that they see through the last regulations, and then the blue is what they project should be happening to meet their target of 100% EV share by 2035. So you can see that it's I mean, we are in a low reach. I mean, again, even though California is pretty advanced in EVs, we are talking about 25% by 25, and then a further growth through the rest of the decade. I mean, 25 to 35, right? But they're also doing something very interesting in terms of the criteria pollutants, which is that recognizing that if you have an EV, it emits zero NOx and hydrocarbons. And so as EVs grow, the ICs could get sort of a free pass at emitting more. And so they're now talking about moving from an overall fleet average a standard to a non-ZEV. So having a SULEV 30 or a 30 milligram per mile standard just for the IC portion of the fleet. So you can imagine that when you're here in this region, in the high, let's say 70% are EVs, the remaining 30% will have to be extremely clean and all will have to, pretty much have to be SULEV 30 compliant to meet these standards, right? And then just a quick comment that, even when we say California, there are these other so-called California states which are signing up for California mandates, right? And so that's about 35 to 40% of the US light duty market, and there are more states that are signing up by the day. So it's a growing market. Not to forget, obviously, that Europe and China are big markets for EVs as well. But again, these are very sort of good regulatory tools that California is bringing to push cleaner transportation, right? But I'm just going to just mention this very quickly, which is that remember that electrification is just one of the tools to get to where policymakers want us to be, right? The end goal being, okay, lower CO2 and lower criteria pollutants. There's the so-called ASI framework is often discussed, avoid, shift, improve. So improve the existing technologies, which is sort of being done traditionally, improving IC engines. Hybridization, I would say, is in electrification. So I'm just highlighting that, but a lot of things that could be done with ICs. Shifting to public transportation, someone mentioned cycling yesterday. Yeah, why not? And moving transportation of goods to rail and marine, all of those can be done. Avoiding putting out CO2 in the first place, that's what electrification is aiming to do. Geofencing, right? Ideas like that are, and then many studies which suggest that even if we do all three of these, there's still going to be CO2 in the atmosphere and we're not going to be able to meet our targets by 2050, and would lead to some correction. So things like CO2 capture or using e-fuels to clean up the rest of the fleet. So make sure that they're CO2 neutral, right? So lots of tools are out there, and I wanted to show the slide because this is in some way the sort of resistance to electrification, and it doesn't have to be, it could be complementary, but this is also what others are working on, and making sure that we work together on solving the CO2 problem, right? Now, one thing I wanted to bring up right up front, because this was mentioned a couple of times yesterday, and I was really glad to hear it. But one of the issues that policymakers have to really pay close attention to is that of environmental justice, right? The idea that whatever spending that we're doing today, incentives, whatever policies are being placed, should benefit everyone, especially the disadvantaged communities. These are people of color, people of lower income, but they should all get to participate in this new economy, right? And I asked a question yesterday about how many vehicles are charged at single homes, and then I remembered that I had seen this actually some time back. So this was presented by UC Davis at a conference last year, and you can see that they show the charging by the housing type and by the models, and pretty much I mean the one on the left is a hybrid, which is why you see that there's a significant amount of apartment charging. But other than that, I mean, most of them, if you add the blue and the orange, these are single family homes or attached homes which have garages and you can charge at home. So today most of the EVs obviously are being bought by people who own dedicated homes. That needs to change as we move further, and so that everyone can actually start purchasing EVs and charge at home or where they live, right? And of course, they'll be charging at workplace, and all of those issues will be solved. But I'm just bringing that out that's something to keep in mind, right? The other is that, look, I get it. EVs get us a significant CO2 reduction, and people see hybrids as more of a distraction. But if you think about it, and I'll make the case in a subsequent slide, that there are a ton of ICs that are going to be sold in the decades to come, or a decade to come, based on your viewpoint. But instead of buying a full ICE, like a pure internal combustion engine, if you buy a hybrid today, they can give you a 20 to 30% reduction or even more. And these are fuel economy, EPA fuel economy numbers, right? So you can get a 30-40% reduction in CO2 without doing anything, right? The same gas station, same infrastructure, but you're emitting. And that could be a pretty significant tool as we move forward while full electrics take market share, right? And by the way, these are the prices that I'm showing here, right? For a IC versus hybrid, and the average cost difference between a hybrid and a full IC is about $2,000 to $3,000 today. So the point is, we are incentivizing EVs at $7,000 and $10,000, which a few people can afford. How about also extending incentives for hybrids so that we can again sort of broaden the electrification and make it available to a broader segment, right? So that's sort of the thinking here as well. The other aspect of environmental justice is that of criteria pollutants. Again, I'm focusing here on particulates, but it would apply to NOx as well. And a lot of studies which show now that the pollutants coming out of the tailpipe of an IC are disproportionately borne by the disadvantaged communities, right? These are basically people who have to buy a home in a congested neighborhood or in a place which is very close to the highway and are exposed to more of these emissions. So on the left is California's 2020 mobile source strategy, showing that yes, compared to the average, people of color and minorities are typically exposed to more PM, and especially the mobile part is shown here. It's more. But here was a recent publication also focusing on this issue and showing that, look, there's more exposure to people of color, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, to these other various sources. Wherever you see red, it is more than the average, right? And blue is less than the average. And what I thought was particularly interesting is that they are calling out light-duty gasoline vehicles as one of the top contributors. It's not just transportation, it's not even like trucks, it is not even light-duty, it is light-duty gasoline vehicles. So it is like the primary mode of transportation that we all use is leading to the most parity in exposure to pollution, right? So this problem needs to be solved, and it's not going to be solved overnight by making everything electric. You have to look at all tools available, and electric is going to play a very important role in solving this problem as well, which is why I think it is very pertinent, right? But where I'm going with this is that, okay, so assume, and I'm going to look at the time here. So assume that let's consider the US only, right? And I'm saying that, let's say it's 25% EV share of new vehicles by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Reasonable assumptions. I mean, some might argue it could be sooner, but let's make that assumption, right? So I'm showing here the EV share with time. And how does that translate into the fleet on the road? Now, today there are about 270, 280 million vehicles on the road, right? The fleet, mostly ICs, obviously. And so those would start reducing with time, and EVs would start increasing with time because of the sales share shown here. But if you go by this, and it's a fairly straightforward calculation, but if you go by this calculation, there are still going to be about 150 million internal combustion engines on the road in 2040. It's only by 2050 that you start seeing these disappear. And I would argue that even then they don't really disappear, because people hold on to some of their cars, older cars for a long time. So the thing is that we are going to see these vehicles on the road for quite a while. And then if you take this one step further and say, okay, fine, so what's the problem? But we are increasing EVs, aren't we going to solve all the problems? So here's my calculation for particulate emissions, right? And if we do nothing today, if we just keep buying ICEs, business as usual, this is how much is the cumulative PM emissions as a function of time. Now, if we do this, I would say fairly rapid electrification, you're going to get a reduction by about 17%, right? On the other hand, if you now start adding filters, which we don't have in the US today, they are being added in Europe and China and even in India, but not in the US. You could get a further, by the way, this includes electrification plus adding filters. So, that's a conservative case. I mean, you could get even more benefit if there wasn't electrification. But anyway, let's keep that aside. 50% of the PM could be reduced between now to 2040 if you had filters. Filters cost in the hundreds of dollars, right? We're talking about $100, $200, $300 of, based on the size of the filter and coating, etc. But the point is, it's hundreds of dollars on a car, which costs $25,000 versus $10,000 of incentives for an EV. Again, this is not an anti-EV pitch, but the point is, we have to make sure that we have to allocate our resources and think about the longer problem and make sure that we get our air cleaner as soon as possible and not look at just one solution. There are many different solutions out there, right? The other aspect, obviously, and I'm not going to spend too much time, I know this crowd gets it, but the batteries, right? I mean, the left two pictures are the same. All I'm doing is now adding the battery capacity that would be needed, right? So I'm assuming here that a car would need 85 kilowatt hours of battery, just roughly an average, and then what I'm showing here is the battery capacity that you would need as all of these EVs become EVs, and also, so you can see it's about 1.5 terawatt hours, and then what I'm showing here with these circles, they're not to scale, but is the number of gigafactories that you would need. And the assumption being one gigafactory making about 35 gigawatt hour per year. Again, that you can debate that, but it's it's not unreasonable. And I think so. You can see by 2030 you'd need 10 gigafactories. By 2040 you'd need about more than, it was actually 41 or 42 gigafactories. Mind you, this is in the US alone, and this is for light duty vehicles only, right? So yesterday we saw that projection that the US is still one of the slowest growing economies, right, for electrification. There's China and there's Europe, and then there will be India and Brazil. So the number of gigafactories that we need to build in this coming decade is incredible. I mean, we have to be building 2 or 3 gigafactories per year just to support the US alone, right? So again, I'm not going to show you, but I know this crowd gets at the mineral constraints that this puts. There's tons of lithium nickel out there. Let me just put it out there, right? Yeah, it's not constrained by the raw materials in the ground, but how quickly can we get it out? And make batteries, and that there is going to be a lag. And again, the point here is of this presentation is that if you're talking about the rate of electrification, all of these factors are going to play a role, right? There's a lag between going from raw materials to supplying enough batteries and making all of these gigafactories, right? Okay, so the other issue, obviously, is the electricity grid, right? The benefits of electrification are only as good as the electricity that fuels the vehicle. And yeah, this is a very cool website. I encourage you to see it if you haven't. Carboncounter.com. You can put in your local grid, electricity, or it'll do it for you, and then you can compare the various vehicles. And what it shows, and I'm picking the US here again just for as a representative. Our national grid is at roughly around 450 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and whereas the California is about 240, and everything is getting cleaner with time, right? Which is important. But today, if you compare, so the black are ICEs vehicles today. These are each dot is an actual model here, right? And then the red or pink are hybrids, and the yellow are battery electric vehicles, right? And what you can see, let's go to California first. There's a clear reduction in CO2 as you go from ICE to BEV. By the way, these are life cycle greenhouse gases, so it includes it's a wells to wheel, and I would say, sorry, the cradle. Well, it includes manufacturing. It also includes wells to wheel CO2, right? And so I don't think it includes the recycling, but I may be wrong. So anyway, and it includes maintenance as well. So BEVs clearly offer a significant advantage with CO2 when the grid is clean. When you go to a not so clean grid as the US average, you're seeing that some of the hybrids actually can be as clean as an EV. So again, the point is that it depends. And by the way, there's a lot of argument on whether it's even appropriate to use an average, because if you live in a state which has a 600 grams of CO2, which there are states in the US like that, what's the point of buying an EV? You're actually hurting the environment, right? So that I'm going to say it outright. Grids are getting cleaner, right? The idea is that in 10 years, this left will start looking like the right. And yes, we will be better off buying an EV, but this is a consideration that has to be done very actively, and policymakers are doing that making sure the grid is also getting greener, right? China is another example. Argonne National Lab made this publication recently showing that, look, in these regions shown in red, you're better off driving an ICE versus an electric. In the blue ones, driving an electric is better just because of the grid carbon intensity, right? And then this is Europe, and these are my calculations too. So here's the point that I wanted to make and sort of transition to the OEM aspect, which is that, okay, so if you look at the CO2 emissions, and I'm showing you these yellow, you can see that CO2 emissions from cars have come down over the years, and then they have actually stalled and actually started increasing in the past 3 or 4 years, right? And this is not good, because OEMs are going to be paying hefty fines for missing those targets. Now, this year, what happened, or last year, 2020, great news. We reduced the CO2 fleet average by, I don't know, it was like 10 or 11. Well, I think it was like 10 or 12% reduction. That is massive, right? Significant reduction in the CO2 like this in 1 year. Clearly, that is because of the EVs that are being sold, right? 11% EVs in Europe, and that and by the year, I mean EVs broadly. They also include plugins. But when this drop happened, that's great. But now look, these EVs are being given a 0 gram per kilometer CO2 at the tailpipe, right? And you can argue whether it's right or wrong, but that's what the regulation is. You're not accounting for upstream CO2 emissions. So if you correct as in if you say, okay, so what about just the IC portion? Well, you're back at this red, and there is essentially little or no improvement in the CO2 coming out of the tailpipe of an ICE. And I do this to emphasize that, look, regulations have to be set in place to also ensure that ICs keep getting cleaner, right, with time, and maybe push more hybrids as well. And that's what some of these are doing. And again, you're going to say, well, the grid is getting cleaner, and yes, you will be right, absolutely. I mean, look at this. This is awesome, right? Look at the carbon intensity of electricity in Europe. It is coming down significantly, and these are the targets. These are the targets for, based on the announcements that are made in Europe, and also the vehicular targets are shown here. One can argue, will this continue at this pace? I mean, there's always, diminishing returns, and also there's more resistance as you start cleaning up the last bit. But I mean, I'm optimistic. Maybe we can get here, but that's where we need to be, right? In this blue square here. Again, just wanted to point out though that CO2, I mean, electrics are a tool for CO2 compliance as well, and that's being shown here, right? One slide. I know this is rather complicated, and wow, I'm already 25 minutes, so I'll be very quick here. I just again wanted to point out that there are many pathways for achieving CO2 reduction, right? So let's say we're starting here with a base IC engine. You can go down this curve to reduce both criteria pollutants and lower wells to wheel CO2 and get to a full electric. Note, I'm not saying it's zero, because there's the upstream emissions as well. But OEMs are also looking at these other ideas from an emissions perspective to reduce emissions, and they're also looking at improving IC engines to get to both lower wells to wheel CO2 and criteria pollutants. So again, this is a sort of a palette of solutions that's out there, and again, I'm just listing here in words. But one thing that I did want to point out here is also this renewable E-Fuels, right? I mean, some of you may or may not like it, but it's happening. It's very much happening, that the idea being, can you take CO2 from the air and combine it with hydrogen that you get from electrolysis using renewable electricity, and combine it to make an e-fuel, and then you basically add BV type CO2 levels from a wells to wheel perspective, right? And so fuels will also play a very important role. Lots of work also being done on hydrogen ICs as an example, right? Okay, so I think I'm pretty much out of time, so I won't go into this. Heavy duty, I just wanted to point out, is also very much rapidly moving towards electrification, most by California. And again, I just wanted to point out that we are in this, believe it or not, in this little yellow rectangle, which it's even tough to see in the US on the PM NOx sort of, and so truck manufacturers looking at this and saying, okay, this last bit of regulation coming up for low NOx is going to be very tough to meet. So how about just start moving towards electrification? So again, my point that I made earlier, that is probably these criteria pollutant regulations which are driving emissions even more than electrification. I won't go into this. This is showing how tough the regulations are. We are going from 400K miles durability to 800,000 miles durability by 2030, and with 90% reduction in NOx and 25% reduction in CO2. And 50% reduction in PM. So trucks are really squeezed into making sure that they are really, really clean. Oh, I will talk about this one last slide before I stop, which is that, okay, so if and they are indeed meeting these norms, what is happening to the NOx really from these trucks? So if you look at the diesel truck emission limits shown by green, they are reducing with time, and then we are moving to these 0.02 grams per brake horsepower by 27. And then you start comparing with NOx from upstream electricity generation in the US. Clearly, the electricity was cleaner up to a certain point, but then starting in 2010, actually trucks are becoming cleaner than the electricity generation. And you can argue that there are some high emitters on the road and that this is not real world driving, and I completely agree. There's a lot of work being done to actually now fix those issues and make these trucks cleaner on the road. But there is a lot of data now that there are already trucks which are emitting at 0.02 levels. So that's two orders of magnitude lower than the electricity. So we have to also make sure that we're not shifting the problem from ICs to electricity, and we have to make sure that the policies are set correctly. But I think this is very encouraging to see both sort of electrics and ICs get really clean, right? So this is I'm going to stop. I just kept this up to show again that there's a lot of options, and fuels are also going to play an important role, and these things are going to compete with each other though. But I think electrification, which I'm showing at the top, are clearly poised to be the dominant technology in the decades to come. Yeah. So with that, I'll stop and see what questions we have.
Dan and Mohammed, you can join us if you want. As usual, Amaya, a very good discussion of the different issues related to policy and the technicalities of the regulations. I always am impressed by the work that you do and your colleague Tim Johnson before you.
Yeah.
And I thought you did a really nice job talking about how long it takes to turn over the fleet. This is something that we've done research on many years ago about how long it's going to take to turn over the fleet, and how that regulators and consumers, when they start talking about what they're expecting from EVs, how long this whole process is going to take. As well as the effects of the grid, the current grid. As we know, the grid's changing. That there is more movement towards away from coal, towards natural gas and renewables. So that will have an effect in the terms of the total life cycle management for the vehicles. One question I had for you when you were talking about your gigafactories, the 40 gigafactories that you say would probably be needed. I just did a quick math on 15 million new vehicles for 40 gigafactories, comes up with about 375,000 batteries per factory per year. Is that a reasonable number? I don't have a sense of if that makes sense.
I think so. I'll have to go back and look at my Excel sheet. And by the way, I'll be happy to share my calculations with anyone who wants it. These are very simple spreadsheets, but I think that sounds about right. These are enormous amounts of batteries that need to be churned out. And again,
Mohammed and Dan, when you talk about putting this many batteries together, does that seem like 375,000 a year seem like a reasonable number?
Haven't made that calculation myself, but just the, let's say, rough estimate that you mentioned seems about right. The scale is on the order of magnitude, I think, is in the right.
Yeah. Dan, you see this probably in hybrid batteries, right? Batteries for plug-in hybrid vehicles, and also for the regular hybrids. Obviously much smaller, right? And so they probably crank out more than this per year, per factory.
I'm not sure. I haven't done the math on that myself, to be honest.
No problem. Amaya, when you look at the, and I think you one of the questions that I had queued up for the role that ICE technologies will play over the next 10 years. And I think you laid that out pretty well. And I think that the big challenge for the manufacturers and suppliers as well is, where do you put investment? When does the tipping point, when do you hit a point where I really can't justify continue making the improvements? And you mentioned a number of improvements that are still coming for ICE vehicles. This is a really delicate, I'm sure, a delicate topic for everybody, right? But from your perspective, how do you see that balancing out?
Yeah, this is a very obviously a very important question, and a very delicate is the right word. I mean, way to lots of factors at play here, right? And I'll say this, right, which is that it's interesting that if anything, we're on the IC side, we are seeing an increase in business moving into this next decade, for the reason that hybrids are growing as well, a lot. Actually, if you see in the US, hybrids have also, I think, doubled in the last year, which, in the US, typically you want of hybrid. And hybrids need more content, not less, right? Because hybrids also have this start-stop, and that leads to more emissions. And there's, also there's the cool down portion, which means that catalysts have to keep getting better. And so actually hybrids need more content, not less. And also the regulations are also getting tighter, right? We are moving towards overall SULEV 30. So we are in this position, and I'm saying we, but very broadly, I think that the industry is seeing that yes, EVs are picking up, But also, by the way, the ICs have to get even cleaner. So there's a lot of investments being made into ICs. So this is this classic, and this again, I keep going back to Clayton Christensen. He talks about this. This is not a bad management decision issue. It is about how do you, you have to, there is a business opportunity here. We have to invest in it while keeping an eye out on the long term. So I don't know. It's tough. There is no, obviously there's no like, 2025, we're gonna stop investing it. There's going to be a transition. But and by the way, it's a local issue too. I want to, we haven't, I didn't touch upon that, but this is a very local problem. I'm looking at as a US centric view today, but India is going to have a very different trajectory on electrification than Europe and China and US. So those investment decisions will have to also be made separately and geographically.
Now, Mohammed and Dan, I don't want to step all over your presentations about this topic, but if you want to add anything to this question, feel free to jump in.
Well, Bruce, I will say that is what I plan to talk about, but it is something that we discuss every day, right? We either within the company itself or when we meet with the customers. This is the biggest issue that's on everybody's plate right now of how to manage the situation, right?
Yeah.
The same. I have a couple of slides that will touch on that, but I second what Amaya mentioned wholeheartedly. One point that I wanted to add here is that the risk-averse automotive industry don't want to become the next Kodak. And this is making it very difficult to make the appropriate decisions, and justifiably, it's a nervous time. So
yeah. Compared to companies that are all electric companies, they do not have to spend money on ICE technologies. They don't have to do this. They have their own issues, because they're small and they need access to capital. They need to expand globally, and all the other the traditional manufacturers are already as global as they want to be probably at this point, and suppliers as well.
Bruce, I'll just quickly make a comment. I thought the Ford F-150 announcements are a fantastic example of exactly this kind of this situation, right? Because they come out with a Lightning, which is magnificent, like a super, like it's the largest selling light duty vehicle in the US. They've made an electric and it's great. I mean, you look at the specs, it's all nice. And it's at 40K, I believe, or something, the starting point. That's perfect. And then a couple of weeks later, they come out with a hybrid Maverick, I think, and it's 20K. Unbelievable, 42 miles a gallon, light duty truck. I mean, so here you have the same company giving out two different options, and they are investing in both of these technologies. So it's a very interesting time.
And the engineering that went into both of those vehicles was tremendous.
Exactly.
And there's as we all know, you put your money up front in development with the plan of making that money back over a period of years as that vehicle is on the road. And it's a tough decision about when to jump in. And I don't envy those the decision makers from the manufacturers and also the supply base. They have to make their own decisions, and we've seen it already in the consolidation that's taken place in the supply base. It may be not always about electrics. Some of it's about autonomous as well, but we've seen some big mergers of very large supplier companies over the past few years, as we've seen the emerging of the new technologies that are going to be expected probably within the next 10 years. Got a couple questions for you, Amaya. What are the challenges for renewables? And it says 3 fuels, and I wonder if you meant e-fuels, to penetrate in the U.S. market. What do you see how do you see the hydrogen engine for commercialization? And what do you see as the challenges? H2 engines require low-grade H2, so the fuel cost can be lower than fuel cell vehicles.
Yeah, so that's fairly broad question, and I think the key challenge with renewable or not renewable, the e-fuels is just that they are currently being produced in very small quantities, right? They're quite expensive. They are not, we are at a much lower volume today. So the idea is that they hopefully get less expensive with time, but it's definitely capital intensive. You have to make sure you get the hydrogen from green sources, so electrolysis of water. And there are arguments, I think good arguments that can be made, which is that, okay, you're trying to sort of do this problem in a very complicated way. You're trying to use renewable electricity to split and make hydrogen, and then combine it with CO2 that you get from the atmosphere and make this e-fuel and then burn it in an engine. Why not just directly use that renewable electricity into an EV? Again, there are arguments on both sides. I know the other one as well, which is that no, but you still have to clean up the existing fleet, which we can do using an e-fuel much more readily. But anyway, to the question, I think the challenges are, again, getting the green hydrogen. Today, I think it's like 98% of hydrogen is made using natural gas, steam methane reforming. And so, we are far away from making hydrogen in those quantities needed to make e-fuels. And so that's going to be the key challenge, I think. And for hydrogen fuel cells, again, I think that's fuel cells definitely are much more attractive for the commercial sector. I think Hyundai just showed 1 million miles in one of the, I think it was Sweden or in Switzerland, that they have done their testing, and the technology works. It's great. You can refuel very quickly, which is of course the key advantage. So I think fuel cells are very much competitive with EVs in the commercial space. That's where the total cost of ownership needs to be, or plays a very important role, obviously. Unlike the passenger car. Passenger car, by the way, I must say this quickly. I still don't think people make decisions based on TCO, right? No one goes to the dealer and says, here's my spreadsheet and I'm going to save 2,000 over the lifetime. Oh, let me buy an EV. Everyone buys in fact, we buy more. Oh, this has a bigger cup holder. So it's completely different. But in commercial, yes, the TCO plays an important role.
Yeah. It's almost the more we talk about it, the more we want to say maybe go to the dealerships and give them the spreadsheets. And you go, let's plug this in so that they can see what. So if they want to make a decision based on color, that's okay. But exactly, I rarely see that at a dealership with that kind of. They kind of like follow what the buyer is kind of interested in. You're interested in this? I can show this to you. Right?
Exactly. But the infrastructure, I didn't answer that question that way. So the hydrogen, of course, the infrastructure is going to be the key, like making sure hydrogen is available everywhere. I think that's EVs still have a significant advantage compared to hydrogen there.
Yeah, that will be an interesting comparison between the development of EVs for heavy duty and the hydrogen for heavy duty. There's really does seem to be a good battle going on there in terms of no clear winner at this point. So the technology is going to be will probably determine and probably not necessary regulations on this in this one. When you compare the EVs and they don't seem like that's going to be a big regulatory hurdle.
Yeah. By the way, hydrogen ICs that I mentioned, and I think that was also part of the question. So when I heard it first a couple of years back, I thought maybe this is some fringe development. No, at Vienna Symposium there was an entire session on that, and I think it was MAN which showed like their whole hydrogen IC engine, which has a very similar performance as a diesel engine. And the key point there as well, there's two. One is lower emissions, practically no particulates, little NOx, but which can be solved easily. And then using, I believe they said like 80% of the hardware remains the same. So it's a good sort of utilization of existing assets. So which is what the sort of their value prop there.
Yeah. Dan, has your company been looking at the hydrogen story?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm going to mention that in my presentation as well. But there was a story a couple of months ago about a Toyota vehicle that finished a race at Fuji Speedway with a hydrogen ICE, and that actually had a Denso fuel injection system on it. So we are involved in that for sure.
Yeah, and I know that it's always been the challenge of how do you create the hydrogen and how much energy do you use to create the hydrogen. And that has been the story, and I haven't really seen anybody come up with a good solution. It's always, we're going to use renewable energy, then everything is fine, right? Then we can do this. And it has some really nice advantages for commercial, because there's certain points, because especially of fleets, where there's certain points along the freeways. If you make these certain points, you fill up here, you continue on, and you get good range on the vehicles, and you meet regulations. So I'm really interested to see how this is going to play out over the next few years. Let's see what else we have here. And Amaya, I think you touched on a lot of the how government regulations, well, and I guess, and we've seen it here in the U.S. in particular. The Obama administration's much more strict. The following administration less strict. New administration more strict, or combination of the two. Over the next 10 years, how do you see this playing out from a manufacturer supplier strategy?
If I knew that, I'd be on an island in Hawaii or something, sipping margaritas. I think I like to think that that train has left now, which is that the current administration will try to put into place policies, before they move into the next round of elections. And so they are trying to really get most of the regulations set that will affect, I would say, at least for the next 8 years or so. And in which case, by then the economy would have, electrification would have kicked off big time, and there would probably be very little looking back, at least in terms of, you could argue the rate would be different in different administrations, but unlike the previous administration, where there was a lot of, there's complete 180 degrees, but yeah. I think now it'll be put in place, so yeah, should be okay.
Very good. All right, thank you very much for your presentation and for your Q&A. Please stick around and kibitz with us the rest of the morning as we talk about very similar topics. And we'll go to our next presenter, Mohammed Fartouri from Bosch. Mohammed is the manager of system engineering, passenger cars and electric vehicles of the Powertrain Solutions Division, North America, Bosch USA. Mohammed, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bruce.
You're ready to go.
Perfect. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's always a difficult situation following Amaya with an excellent presentation, and also the topics that he is touching are going to be trickled in. I have a little bit of a different view that I'm bringing today, but the general theme is still the same. What I want to present in the next 20 or some minutes is the view that we have at Bosch regarding the powertrains of the future, and what are the solutions that we can meet the climate goals. And we at Bosch think that the solution needs to be a technology neutral solution. In Amaya's presentation, as well as the discussions that we just had, there were lots of discussions about the different use cases, different classes of vehicles, and this will dictate different solutions. And what I will highlight here, that the effective environmental protection requires this holistic view of different powertrain types, and the technology neutrality will get us through the optimization that we need to have within each of these powertrains to optimize the use cases with what the customer needs. So Setting the picture, it was also mentioned a little bit in Amaya's presentation, mobility is a fundamental necessity for humans. And this is, we are living at a time that this growth is a consistent growth. It's not a gradual growth, I would say, for the total passenger transport mileage, 3% year over year over the few decades is a significant growth. This is also being reflected on the freight demand, is the tons kilometers over the past decades. It's actually a little bit steeper. What we are seeing in the passenger side of it, the passenger transportation, the paradigm here is that the end consumer, the passenger, wants to have the quick transportation, affordable transportation, eco-friendly transportation. And the combination of this is what the end consumer as a passenger, let's call it, is demanding. In the freight side, what we are seeing, the growth, and the growth that is even steeper is based on the growth in the urbanization and also industrialization globally, as well as the disruptive changes of e-commerce that is changing the way that the goods are being shipped around. So in order to fulfill this necessity for transportation, as I mentioned, we need to have a holistic view. I will highlight a few of the technologies that we see fit and what are emerging and what we are working on. But what I want to highlight here in this, the decision for the powertrain mix, and you will see the symbol, and I will get back to this time and time again, is that it has to be involved, let's say, the green aspect or ecological aspect of it. This isn't only CO2, as Amaya mentioned. Criteria pollutants has to play significant role in the decision-making as well. Obviously, the end consumer or the fleet consumer is very important. The use case is important. And finally, it needs to be financially sound decision. So going through the battery electric vehicle, what we see the resurgence of the battery electric vehicle is that they are really fun to drive. They make the day-to-day commute that is for the urban and suburban communities near zero emission in terms of CO2. And this sustainability aspect that we have with the electric mobility is a significant driver to basically propel the battery electric vehicles into the numbers that we are seeing that was highlighted by Amaya as well. What we also see is that the affordability of the battery electric vehicle will scale with the developments that we have, and I will touch on that in the next slide. And this needs to be in the discussion point and has to be included in the paradigm of the decision making. At Bosch, we are offering a wide range of products. This is starting from the modules for energy efficiency with our next generation silicon carbide semiconductors, to the components and subcomponents such as power electronics, inverters, e-machines, integrated subcomponents into the system integration such as Charcon or e-axle, all the way to the integrated drivable vehicles that we call the rolling chassis. And we are involved in all of this basically chain of products. The pillars that are very important and essential in the growth of electromobility can be summarized in three pillars. One is the range, one is the vehicle cost, and infrastructure. And these are not standalone pillars. There is interconnected effects that are linking the parameters that we are discussing here. I'm not going to go through all of the the examples, but for example, when we are talking about the range and the technology development that needs to happen to address this range, I can highlight the silicon carbide power electronics that I mentioned. And in terms of the inverter, what you can see is that with the next generation, you can increase the efficiency of your silicon carbide inverter that will have an integrated effect when you're matching it with the e-axle. It will either give you a longer range, or at a given range, it will mean that you can reduce the cost of vehicle by reducing the size of the battery, as well as the weight of the vehicle. That the reduction in weight will also translate to better range. The other aspect that we look into the electromobility, cost sensitivity is high. And from our perspective, there is a little bit of a shift in the paradigm of the OEs, that we don't think that the likes of, you will have a portfolio of whatever, tens of engines for each OEM, and each of them will have their unique engines with different displacements and so on and so forth. We need to make sure that the cost paradigm is also scalable. And we are getting that through the flexibility that is also integrated into the modular designs that can be standardized and be implemented in the applications. So at Bosch, we have been involved in the electromobility for 15 years, and we already have 2.5 million of vehicles that have Bosch electromobility products. Infrastructure, obviously, Amaya also mentioned, and yesterday there was the discussions about the infrastructure. What I want to highlight in addition to that, and not repeat that, is that beyond the number of public charging stations that are needed, in terms of the user experience, you have to also think about the ease of the usage of these systems. Bosch is bringing the competency that we have in Internet of Things, as well as the connectivity, to basically provide a better user experience for the end consumer in terms of ease of the charging of the electric vehicle. Now, shifting the gears towards some of the discussions that we also had in the Q&A session just before, what we see based on the classes of vehicle and the use cases in the future, hydrogen-based powertrains, and also, if I may add here, also other synthetic fuels will have an additional, let's say, location, or an additional pie, a piece of the pie, in addition to the battery electric vehicles. And what is important is that the fuels that we are discussing for the hydrogen and the synthetic fuels, as Amaya mentioned, need to come from carbon neutral sources, i.e. green hydrogen, for example. So talking a little bit about why I mentioned the different use cases, and Bruce, you also mentioned different aspects of the different use cases. If we focus on the commercial vehicles, what we have today is the predominant diesel powertrain servicing this class of vehicle. And with the changes that we are seeing and towards the carbon neutrality, we can see for the smaller size commercial vehicles, maybe up to class 6 commercial vehicles, or the, let's say, last mile delivery commercial vehicles, or drayage type of applications, battery electric vehicle still fulfills the carbon neutrality element, as well as provides the reasonable length in terms of a reasonable range in terms of the day-to-day application of such vehicles. But when we go through the long-haul transportation, what we are seeing here is that the recharging intervals, as well as the payload penalty that the battery electric vehicle might have, has that crossover that the alternative transportation powertrains are becoming more and more attractive. Hydrogen ICE was discussed. Amaya actually had a plug. I have another shameless plug here that we had our publication in the Vienna Symposium, and I would gladly refer to that publication. If you need it, please contact me directly and I can provide a copy for you. What I would like to focus on, with that aside, I wanted to focus on the hydrogen fuel cell that we briefly also discussed. Not going through the details, at the heart of the fuel cell, we have the fuel cell stack. So the fuel cell stack is producing the electricity from the chemical reaction between the hydrogen and the continuously fed hydrogen and air, oxygen in the air, and basically you will have the electricity or the current as a byproduct. It is a fairly complex system. It's not like a simple, let's say, experimental or laboratory when we are putting it in commercial vehicles with the use case requirements that we are discussing. Managing the system, including the thermal management as well as the lifetime requirements, is significant development activity that we are working on, and we have our partner. And at Bosch, we are similar to the electrification. We have a portfolio that spans from individual components, subcomponents, all the way to stacks that can be basically, as it says, it can be stacked and scaled for performance depending on the use case, or also going all the way to the fuel cell power module, which includes the whole power delivery module within one box. What is very important, as Amaya mentioned, is that the solution that we have cannot ignore the internal combustion engine. And internal combustion engine, the CO2 aspect of it was very well highlighted by Amaya. In terms of the future eco-friendly ICE, we need to also take into consideration the impact of air quality in terms of the criteria pollutants. And this is the point that I will spend a couple minutes to discuss some of the functions that also Amaya mentioned. At Bosch, we have looked at this at a holistic picture. So there are individual aspects that you can basically develop measures for optimization of let's say, the fuel injection system with the next generation 350 and 500 bar gasoline direct injection, yet that can reduce the engine out criteria pollutants emissions, including the particulate matter and particular number and mass. But this isn't just like one aspect of the optimization. One needs to look at the holistic approach. So from the engine out, we need to also include the sensors that need to be developed, and we have these sensors developed, and future generations of the sensors that are coming on board very rapidly. What we want to address is that the use cases of the gasoline ICE will have a reduction in criteria pollutants in real drive emissions. And this means that day-to-day use cases that one have, and it is not only tied to for example, a 20-second idle that you have in the US regulatory drive cycles. The other aspect that was also mentioned, criteria pollutants, one of the important portion is the particulate emission with the gasoline direct injection, and even with the reductions of the engine out emissions. In order to have the minimal impact on air quality, we see the need for particle filters that, as Amaya mentioned, are being introduced in other regions, and this can be also introduced in the US. In terms of after-treatment system, this is getting more and more important when we are discussing hybrid topologies with stop-start or with the PHEVs, that you would have a longer longer non-operating ICE. And when you are operating the ICE, you need to ensure that the after-treatment is effective at that first start, and electrically heated catalyst as well as a burner concept is our solution for these externally heated catalysts, so that your catalyst has the optimum conversion efficiency no matter how you're driving the car, and when you're starting, depending on environmental conditions, you don't need to have a longer period of tailpipe emission before your catalyst reaches the conversion efficiency. The aspect that I also mentioned, and it was mentioned, dehybridization, I completely agree with Amaya's assessment that smart hybridization is the pathway to reduce the existing, basically, CO2 emissions, as well as the criteria pollutant emissions of the existing fleets of the technology of today. What I also want to mention is that even looking forward with the developments that we have in the electric drives, so in terms of e-machines and power electronics, the scaling effect of that is making it like trickling down, if you will, to the hybrid propulsion as well, which the consequence here is that you can optimize and even design your ICE given these powerful hybrid propulsions that you have, so that your optimization of your what we call the dedicated ICE is to enable a very high brake thermal efficiency and very low emissions in terms of the engine out emissions. So this is basically what we see as the next leap in the hybridization and the matching of the developments that we have in the ICE to basically bring the both ends and have a holistic view and an optimized design in mind. What we also can see in the high voltage hybridization is that what we call the E-axle or four-wheel drive option, that you optimize your ICE for front-wheel drive application, and you have an electrically driven real wheel axis that can be independently doing the torque vectoring depending on the use cases of your vehicle. Also in this region, I'm not repeating everything again, we have the very broad portfolio that we are looking into the components, but also from the system competency and software and operating strategy, we have developed what is needed to basically optimize all of these components together. One aspect which was discussed, the renewable synthetic fuels, I mentioned it a little bit earlier as well. We see this as the very important factor to get to climate neutrality. Just a number here, Amaya mentioned 275 million US vehicle fleet. When we look at the global picture, we have 1.3 billion, approximately 1.3 billion vehicles on the road today. And if we want to have an impact on reducing the carbon dioxide emission of these vehicles, depending on the newly integrated or newly basically introduced battery electric or fuel cell electric fleets, will take a very, very long time, as Amaya showed earlier today. The point here is that introduction of these synthetic fuels, liquid synthetic fuels that can be blended into the existing gasoline infrastructure. These fuels need to come from the sources of, let's say, the renewable sources and carbon neutral in one sense in terms of the CO2 capture. This can also basically fulfill what Amaya mentioned, levels of well-to-wheel analysis that is parallel to battery electric vehicle. And depending on how you can design the fuel and the the components and constituencies in the fuel, you can reach different levels of carbon offset or carbon reduction, carbon intensity reduction in these fuels. We have been active in this realm as well. In the near future, our focus is to have fuels that can be blended within the norms of the existing fuels. This would be the EN 228 norms for gasoline, for example, in Europe, that can be used in the fleet. And this is very important. We wouldn't need any retrofitting. This would be applicable to all of the fleet. So basically, by blending these, every gallon or every liter of fuel that is blended within the gasoline, you are already reducing the CO2 based on this well-to-wheel reduction of the CO2. This has been implemented in Bosch facilities with a collaboration with a fuel supplier and an OEM. We have in Bosch fuel stations, gas stations, and diesel stations, the blue gasoline and blue diesel that have 20% well-to-wheel CO2 reduction. And one can project this towards the fuels that are even getting, as I mentioned, to 100% neutrality. The cost of this is a question mark, but as we discuss the cost, I mean, everything has a cost. The battery will have a cost. The incentives that we are paying for battery electric vehicle has a cost. There was a talk yesterday by European Union to increase the tax of the petroleum fuels. So the cost paradigm is the political discussion that it shouldn't be impeding the technical solution. We think that there is a good potential to have a technical solution that can address 1.3 billion vehicles on the road today. And finally, I would like to basically close the section and then go to the Q&A with highlighting what I described here. The powertrain can become clean and CO2 neutral. There are various paths that we can achieve this carbon neutrality, and the climate goals through these clean powertrain can already be implemented today with increasing the electrification and also use of the renewable energy sources. At the end, what is very crucial is that we want every vehicle, existing vehicle on the fleet or the new vehicle that is run to be run with the energy that is coming from renewable resources, be it the electricity that is coming from renewable energy or the liquid or hydrogen fuel, synthetic fuel that is being produced by renewable fuels. With that, I want to thank everyone who spent the past, 24 minutes, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed. Yeah, I think you did a really nice job in bringing in a number of points that that really need to be talked about when we're looking at the transition to EVs. One is looking at transportation overall, looking all the different forms of transportation that are part of the story. The point that you made about urbanization and we've heard this talk about this for many years now, right? The continued growth of urbanization, and I wanted to just kind of bring this up to the group. To me, when we talk about this, and it came up yesterday, and it came up in our survey as well, where most people are charging at home with EVs. In urbanization, people may not have single-family dwellings, and if people continue to move to cities and where they're living in apartments or condominiums, it seems to work against charging infrastructure. Am I thinking clearly about this? Is this going to be kind of this urbanization progress, if you want to call it that, or movement, will make it actually harder to make the transition to EVs?
For sure. I mean, it is an impact that you mentioned, right? So just put it in perspective. If you're talking about one of the mega cities, Shanghai, 20 plus million, and if you have been to Shanghai, pretty much, I would say, I don't have the statistics, but a very insignificant number of the population have their own like garages and then the dwelling. It is a mega city with a lot of like, let's say, apartment complex and whatnot. The solutions that you would have for the in-house charging for the battery electric vehicle would not work. But at the end, I don't want to say that this technological obstacle should not be a deterrence. There are solutions with the fast charging, the charging stations, charging at the hubs, charging at the work. There are companies in China working on the battery swaps. What I am basically preaching today is that we need to have a holistic view. We shouldn't let our biases from the past or the future or the shiny future to pigeonhole all of the solutions towards one potential option only. And I completely agree. And this is a challenge. In US, we can get away with this for the main part, but there are, even in US, there are some cities, New York City, for example, will have the same issues, but the globe is not US only. And as a global supplier and a company, and also when you're talking about ecological effects and eco-friendly aspects, climate change is not a localized problem. So we need to have the solution that also works in like Mumbai and Shanghai, not only working in Ann Arbor.
Amaya or Dan, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, so I think Mohammed just nailed it. He covered all of the points. Maybe one small additional make is, I think the bigger issue with urbanization is not the impact on electrification, but impact on car ownership per se. I mean, if you look at most people living in New York or Shanghai, as you mentioned, or people just don't want to buy a car, right? I mean, it's like more of a hassle to buy and park it and so on. So I think that's where perhaps the Ubers make more sense than owning a car. And of course, then I think it's how fleets should be electrified is probably a bigger question. And I see California's already started on that as well. So very interesting to see how that works. I saw some economics on Ubers, and I was quite surprised to see how little margins they have for every ride. And now to add on the electric cost is going to be, again, none of this is insurmountable. My point is that it's going to be a very interesting way how they come up with innovative ways to make money with all of this.
And did you want to add anything on this?
I think it was Amaya that said previously that this is a local issue, right? And I think that the barriers are very different depending on what region you're talking about, right? If you would ask someone in middle America what their barriers are to EV, it's not going to be that I don't have a place to charge it, right? It's that I'm afraid I can't make it my 200-mile ride to wherever that I take, once a month to go to the beach or whatever the situation is, right? So I think the barriers are different based on what region you're talking about.
Yeah, very good. Mohammed, is Bosch doing any work in batteries?
In terms of the low voltage battery, 48-volt battery is in our portfolio, but a couple of years ago, we made the decision not to involve the significant investment that would be required at a company like Bosch to bring the batteries into scale. So the answer is no, we do not produce battery cells for the high voltage batteries, but in terms of battery management systems and also the charging, and one aspect that I somewhat alluded here is that the service that we have, which is called battery on the cloud, which would be basically the digital twin of the battery in the individual vehicle that is being basically augmented into the cloud, that gives both the end consumer as well as the fleet operator the real-time signals of the battery health, as well as the battery utilization and optimization of the charging and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Last year we had a speaker from LG talk about the something that they were working on, which is tracking battery health, which I think you're really onto something there. Excuse me. This is an issue that it's not very clear, especially as vehicles age. What kind of shape is my battery in, especially when you look into the used vehicle market, right? And that's coming down the road. And I thought you really did a nice job with the E-Fuel story, because it really does talk about the potential for dealing with the current fleet and making the current fleet cleaner for a long period of time. If the transition takes longer than expected, and even in our survey, when you talk about the increases in hybrids combined with the spark ignited engines, you're going to have vehicles that have engines in them for a long period of time.
Exactly, and this is the point. We see this as a multiplier. It doesn't mean that you stop improvements in the hybrid electric vehicles or PHEVs and whatnot. This would be an added multiplier that is after the fact, or upstream, actually, upstream of that would be implemented.
Yeah. One of the questions here, and it's a nice one. We've kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of the making decisions about in terms of technology. It says, given the pace of change in requirements, regulations, etc., and the various technical developments, how do all the three suppliers that we have here today deal with the uncertainty of volume and demand from OEMs?
I'll start. It is very challenging, and we have many people, product managers, that are constantly looking into the basically pulse of the market, discussing with the OEMs, taking into consideration the upcoming regulatory changes, and based on that, we try our best. Are we going to be successful in all of these decisions? Probably not, but it is a very actively being worked on at various levels in all regions. And this isn't just the US issue. In Europe, in China, in India, everywhere globally, we are seeing this same.
Yeah. It just makes the whole job a little more challenging, doesn't it?
Right.
Dan, do you want to jump in on that one?
I'm not sure I can say it any better than Mohammed did. I mean, it's a constant challenge. We have very few meetings where that topic doesn't come up, right? About how do we predict, how do we estimate, how do we plan?
Yeah. Amaya?
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I think there's a short-term and a long-term element to this. I mean, like Mohammed was mentioning, we're always in touch with our customers to make sure we're not missing, something in the near term. Like, if California is saying Lev 4, let's make sure that they are not like, there's no knee-jerk reaction saying, okay, that's it, 2025 and beyond, we're going to kill this model. Then we should at least know that. But then there's, of course, the longer term, which is, of course, the more sort of difficult one, which is, okay, what is our OEM strategy? And I must say, it's not made easy at all by OEM executives making one comment in one conference and another in another. And it just drives me nuts when I see that, someone saying, oh, we're going to kill an IC after 25. And it's like, oh, no, what we meant is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, okay. So then it starts this chain of, oh, what do we do? And now it makes it very confusing. Yeah.
It's like the GM 2035 announcement. And you go, wait a minute, what we meant was, this is our goal.
Exactly. These keywords are very carefully chosen, right? Their goals, targets, and then there'll be an asterisk at the top and bottom. Applies only to Europe, not to China and US. And it's like, oh yeah, right. Just those two small markets and so on. Anyway, but no, it's typically makes it difficult to sort of follow. I must say one other thing is this chip issue that is happening now is a very nice small example of what I mean. It's not a nice situation, but it's an example of how it makes our decision making very difficult. Like we have to now really guess, right, how quickly will this issue be over and how we'll overcome that. But that's a smaller example of what we are looking at into the future.
Right. I know that when General Motors was first starting out with the battery electrics, with the Volt and then into the Bolt, and they were working with the battery companies, and they were talking about estimates of how many vehicles they would sell, and I know this is always a challenge for suppliers, because they say, oh, it's going to be 200,000, and it ends up being 30,000, and you go, oh, so next time you mention this to us, we're not going to build a plant for 200,000. We're going to build a plant for maybe 50,000. So I think it's always a challenge for the suppliers, for especially if you read manufacturer press releases, as opposed to and it probably even goes with even internal discussions about with the manufacturers about where they think they're heading. And how many?
It depends on which group you're talking to, right? If you talk to the battery folks at one OEM versus the IC folks, probably you get two different stories as well.
Yeah. So, very challenging, very challenging for the supply base. Yeah. Mohammed, when you look at how Bosch has organized itself to deal with the transition to EVs, what kind of company changes have you guys made to make it easier for you guys to respond?
So as I mentioned, just like talking about electromobility, we have been in this area for 15 years. We already have our products in 2.5 million. But what we are discussing now here is that how we can like exponentially accelerate the development and the introduction to the market. Mm-hmm. We have spent a lot of money in the past years. We have spent 6 billion euros in the electromobility, and this is also being reflected in basically at the working level. What I can add to your like working culture, what is different is that, just bluntly putting it here, there is also the social aspect that Amaya mentioned. The workforce that is required for a battery electric vehicle is an order of magnitude lower than a workforce that would be required for, let's call it, a diesel vehicle. And this having this transition to be a socially acceptable way, we have a lot of efforts internally to train the folks to be trained into the new areas, learning new aspects. At the end of the day, a design is a design. If you're designing a coolant passage for an inverter, isn't that different than designing a hydraulic passage for example, like whatever, another IC component? But the sheer factor here is that in terms of the workforce, there is going to be effects moving very quickly to the battery electric vehicles, that you don't need as many components and you don't need as large of a workforce. This is only Bosch. This will be also the OEMs and other suppliers. And the management of that needs to be carefully and socially acceptably done.
Mm-hmm. Dan, did you have anything you want to add on that?
The only thing I would add is that within Denso, what we've discovered as we work on some of these newer technologies is that it's an opportunity for us to work cross-functionally in different ways than we have before. So the lines between, say, thermal and powertrain are getting thinner and thinner every day, and we're realizing that it's advantageous to put those folks together as we work on some of these solutions, right? So some of our traditional boundaries, I'll say, are coming down, and I think that's good for efficiency and for the product development.
Amaya, how are things at your place?
Yeah, I like what Dan just mentioned, that sort of the boundaries between our various sort of core competencies are beginning to, I wouldn't say disappear, but sort of become thinner. So for example, we are primarily actually a glass company, right? So we're a materials company, and we make glass and optical fiber and all of that, right? And our treatment systems. And now in this new age, you're looking at, oh, maybe we can sell thinner glass for electric vehicles. So there's an added feature of, lower weight there, or improved infotainment panels. And, so we're looking at this new mobility world through a different lens, saying, okay, how can we participate even more in that sense? And so, yeah, working much more across boundaries that traditionally existed.
Very good. Very good. I think that that's it for right now. I want to start by talking a little bit about a recent research project that we finished on Tesla. This is all part of the Powertrain Strategies for 21st Century program. And this survey we're calling the Tesla effect. Again, as usual, we like to thank our sponsors, our affiliates that sponsor all of our research projects. This is, as I said, and as it is for all of our powertrain surveys, it's a survey of powertrain experts. We're asking them for their predictions for 2025 and 2030, and these surveys took place in February or March of this year. We had about 69 respondents. We had from manufacturers, suppliers, and primarily this time from the powertrain experts from academic research, government, NGOs, and consultants. And these crossed a variety of titles. As with our powertrain survey, we're usually looking at means, and also the responses are weighted by the respondents' confidence in their response. So we start out by asking them about where they thought the market share would be for Tesla, and they're expecting growth by 2030. You can see here the actuals, the 2025, what they expected for 2025 and for 2030 in terms of that. Actually, so there's growth in market share, but when you look at there's growth, but I don't think they meant market share here. I think they just in general growth. But when you look at market share, you see the market share reducing or being compared to what it is today, because there are going to be so many more competitors in the market. They're kind of split on whether they think Tesla will have a model for at $25 price range by 2025. They believe that Tesla will be able to sell directly to consumers in all states by 2030. This will be a challenge, as anyone who knows the dealership network in the United States is very strong and within each state. So this is probably going to be a bit of a challenge. They are split about whether they think that the change in the sales model in some states, if they would change their sales model to comply with laws that ban direct sales from manufacturers. So there's a split in where they think that this is going to be a challenge for them or not. They believe Tesla's direct sales method is important, though, in developing their customer loyalty. And this is something that makes them different from other manufacturers. They also see that they're optimistic that the U.S. service centers will be a profitable business segment for Tesla in 2030. This is something that has been a bit of a problem, I think, for Tesla, in that there's been some consumer complaints about being able to get their vehicles serviced in a timely manner. They do believe the expansion of the service centers will result in increased sales. So there's going to have to be, Tesla's going to have to invest in more service centers to be able to support their business. In terms of the over-the-air software updates, they expect that other manufacturers will catch up, but it's going to take 1 to 4 years, depending on who you talk to, about how long it's going to take to catch up in terms of over-the-air software updates. A number of participants said that other manufacturers already do this. It's just that it's not advertised very well. They're not completely convinced that Teslas will appreciate in value. Some feel that it's possible, but others feel that it's not as big a deal. They believe that Tesla's over-the-air updates are important to strengthening their customer loyalty. And this is something that's that of course I think all manufacturers are aware of it and keeping an eye on. They do believe that the paid upgrades are also important to their profitability. And this is where you can turn on certain parts of your vehicle to maybe make it faster or to get a more range out of your vehicle. This is something they sell as upgrades to their vehicles that are already in the fleet. This is something when we discuss this with the manufacturers, this is a very interesting point to be able to, where you see manufacturers being able to actually be a bigger player in the aftermarket, to be able to upgrade their vehicles in a way that without even going to dealerships, something that would we'll see that probably into the future. They believe that there's going to be an increase and a needed increase of about 98% of superchargers by 2025 that will be required to keep up with demand. And they believe that the expansion of the supercharger network will be important to the growth of Tesla. They believe that Tesla currently has an advantage in battery management technology. And that it'll take about 1 to 4 years for other manufacturers to catch up. They believe that it's moderately important that for Tesla to start producing its own batteries. So there's some discrepancy on this, but they think in general it's important. They think that they'll be able to start producing their own batteries within the next 10 years. Oh, I'm sorry, within the next 5 years. Tesla's experts believe Tesla's currently has an advantage in onboard computing compared to other manufacturers, but they think that the manufacturers could catch up within 1 to 4 years. They don't expect Teslas to have fully autonomous capabilities by the end of 2021, as their CEO was suggesting. But they do think that they will have it by 2031, so 10 years from now. And when we ask them about when they think, in general, fully autonomous vehicles will be available to consumers, they also agree that it's in the 2031 to 2040 timeframe, and compared to what other people may be prognosticating. And when they talk about the success, what parts of the company and what all the things that Tesla does that actually relate to their success, it's really non-performance issues. Brand loyalty, public perception, reputation for innovation are the three main areas that they report as being the aspects of the company that contribute the most to their success. And they also think that, in closing, that OEMs will overtake Tesla once they're committed to an EV strategy. And so this is some of the results. There are more results coming from this. We'll be sending out a more advanced analysis that compare manufacturer, supplier, and other groups' responses to these questions, and also comments from the respondents that will be part of the package that we send out to our affiliates. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask. And now let's go on to our next speaker. Looking at Dan Ronayne from Denso. Dan is the Director of Gasoline Hardware Engineering and Powertrain Control Systems and Evaluation at Denso International America. Dan, thanks for joining us. Take it away.
Okay. Let me know, Bruce, when you can see my screen.
Okay. And you're up, and now you are up.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. I'm Dan Ronayne from Denso International America, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about Denso's approach to the EV transition. So agenda, we'll do a quick intro, some background, talk about Denso's priorities and our approach, and then wrap it up. I do want to start with a little bit of a homework assignment. Bruce, you brought it up earlier in the discussion today, but part of the role of one of my teams is providing guidance to our product groups about market trends, analysis, and this sort of thing. And roughly once a month, someone brings us a chart that looks like this and wants to talk to us about the knee in this curve of when the market share is going to take that big uptick for EVs. And they bring us these charts and say, is this accurate? And obviously this is a difficult question to answer. It got me thinking about how I wanted to talk through this today. So it made me think that this happens to me, maybe it happens to you, but I wonder if your job feels a bit like this, or perhaps maybe like this. And what I think about when I think about trying to time the transition to EVs is a bit like trying to time a very high, very far jump, where if you take off too soon, you're going to run out of momentum. You might not make it to the other side. Whereas if you wait too long, you're going to run out of road. So what I want to talk about today is how we work through that transition at Denso and how we're planning for that future. A little bit of introduction first. Denso sometimes be a bit of a quiet company, but just to everybody know, we're the second largest global supplier, just behind our colleagues at Bosch. We are a Japanese company, but we have a significant presence in North America as well. 23 companies with more than 24,000 employees, more than 17,000 in the US. And that's our headquarters in Southfield. I get there occasionally now. I used to be there every day. I do miss it a little bit. So some background, we can't have a conversation about the transition to EV without starting with a chart like this that talks about regulations. Of course, we know this is what's on the books now. And as you mentioned earlier, Bruce, any minute we should hear about what the next rulemaking will look like. We kind of expect it'll be something in this area, but we do know that things are going to change. This chart was actually shown before. I do like it though. One of the things that we know are coming, there's ICE bans that have been mentioned throughout the world, lots of them in Europe, some in North America, and even California has gotten in on the act. So we know those changes are coming in the future, some as early as 2025. And we also know what the market has done in the past. If we look at CO2 emissions over time, we can see the general trend, and then we can see where some of the targets that have already been posted are taking us. But one thing we know for sure is that the challenge for the OEMs is huge. So if we go back to this chart and zoom out a little bit, what we think about is what's going to happen in this time frame and how do we prepare for it. And Amaya, you mentioned earlier about if you knew the answer to this, maybe you'd be on an island somewhere. I have another picture here that maybe your job feels like this a little bit, of being asked to be a fortune teller. By the way, my crystal ball is broken. If you happen to have one that's working, let me know. We've got a spot for you on the Denso systems team. But as we move forward, we have to think about how do we prepare for these transitions. So we do know things are changing quickly. Bruce, you've mentioned this quite a bit today. The OEMs seem to be in a constant competition to stay on top of the EV newsfeed, whether it's talking about investment in electrification or increase in market share, but they're all out there, they're all talking about it, and we all know this is coming. However, we also know at the same time that a huge portion of their activities comes from funding that's generated from gas and diesel powered ICE, SUVs, and trucks. So the challenge for a company like Denso is looking at both sides of that spectrum. How do we help our customers create the future while still supporting those highly profitable ICE activities? So with Denso, it starts with our goal for 2030, which we want to be a company that continuously generates value to enrich mobility, that achieves sustainability, happiness, and peace of mind for everyone. And we break that into two major sections, green and peace of mind. And our powertrain activities, our propulsion activities fall into the green area where we're focused on vitality for the environment. But that's not anything new for Denso. We've been at this for more than 20 years now. You can go back to 2000 when we released our EcoVision 2005, where at that point we were already talking about reducing CO2. And then following our efforts to promote electrification back from the early 2000s through now. And of course, activities in the ICE area and even non-automotive areas. But we've been at this for a while now, reducing our CO2 emissions throughout our operations around the world. So Denso announced at the top or the end of last year our intention to be carbon neutral by 2035. We're going to achieve that through 3 pillars: by eliminating the CO2 emissions from our plants, by minimizing the CO2 emissions from our mobility products, and then what we aren't able to eliminate from our products, we offset through capture and reuse. So through these initiatives, we will be carbon neutral by 2035. But looking at that in a bit more detail, we look at the approach to this as a carbon cycle, where we start with the raw materials that we use. We look at the parts that go into our components, how we manufacture them, how our customers put our parts into their cars, how those parts are used, and then how disposal of those products are handled. We also look at the how we generate and how we use energy in our plants. And one thing that we're proud of, we now have an operating CO2 circulation plant at our Anjo Electrification Innovation Center in Japan, where this is operating now, where we're capturing CO2 from our manufacturing operations, processing it and putting it back into our processes as fuel. But coming back to the balance or the approach towards carbon neutral, as all good engineers do, we must start with a hypothesis. We talked before in one of the other presentations about the iteration that's happening with ICE and have focusing on increasing thermal efficiency and energy regeneration. That activity is ongoing, but as we step forward, there's 2 primary pillars that we need to follow. Obviously, electrification technology is a huge portion of that, talking about things like inverters and MGs and how we can apply those to not only BEV vehicles, but to fuel cell vehicles moving forward. At the same time, we need to make sure that we're thinking about how we use our ICE technology, our existing products, to support that same transition. So whether it's core technology from ICE that can be used for bio and e-fuels, or even taking that into hydrogen ICE, which we talked about a little bit before, and I'll bring up again. And then some of that could translate even into fuel cell vehicles as we move forward. So our approach is maximizing our ICE products while developing new technology to support the carbon neutral transition. From Denso's point of view, the focus is understanding the total energy management system, from infrastructure all the way to the vehicles, and then making sure that we're offering powertrain and thermal products that support carbon neutrality for each one of those areas. So whether we're talking about hybrids or BEVs or fuel cell, or even air mobility, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we need to make sure that we are considering how our customers are working in each of those spaces and then offering appropriate technology. And we did talk about a little bit earlier, Bruce, about the Toyota engine that finished the 24-hour race at Fuji Speedway with a fully hydrogen ICE powertrain. So the way we look at this, lay it out like this, where in the center, you can see the power source. And then we think about what are the different platforms that our customers might use, whether it's a hybrid, whether it's pure ICE or hydrogen ICE, a fuel cell or a BEV. And then how can we apply our technology appropriately to support the customer moving forward, whether it's fuel injection or engine management for biofuel and e-fuel, whether we're boosting efficiency of EVs through thermal technology to through efficient cooling or thermal management, whether the various applications for hydrogen technology, or thinking about electrification and battery management, power supply, and drive system. But the key here is that we have to support a diverse powertrain mix moving towards 2030 and beyond. So talking about a few of those examples specifically, our ElectCore product line, we're supporting electrification in all areas of mobility. And what I mean by that is thinking about mobility from small individual mobility like a scooter all the way up to heavy duty trucks. And then thinking about what the energy management system that is needed for that type of mobility, how our customers are going to attack that particular segment, whether it's a HEV or a BEV or a fuel cell. And then how do we apply the expertise that Denso has in those particular areas to support what our customers are trying to do, whether it's an MG inverter or thinking about high efficiency engine management, e-fuels, hydrogen burning, and then across the bottom, thinking about our thermal areas, whether it's AC and cooling, and then an overall connected system to support the total vehicle. So our focus is talking about wide output range and thinking about small mobility to large trucks. And then one of the neat things to discuss, I'm kind of excited about this. I've been in automotive for more than 20 years. This is the first time I've been able to talk about air mobility in one of my presentations. But this is an activity that Denso announced earlier this year. We've actually signed an agreement with Honeywell to produce an electric propulsion system for air mobility. And what we're bringing to that equation is our production capabilities, our high quality products that we've learned from the automotive side, and we're supporting Honeywell into the air mobility market. The reason this is exciting for us is a couple of points. One, it's obviously a new business area for us, which is always exciting. But secondly, it's a connection into a completely new market with new technology, new needs, new pain points. And how can we learn from that as we adapt our technology to air mobility and then feed what we're learning back into the automotive business so that we can win on both sides. And this is quite an exciting area for us that is just now getting started. One of the other key areas that we talk about is our heat pump for EV. And this is a key enabler for EV because it's an efficiency improvement. We've done that in a couple of ways. One of the key issues with heat pumps is efficiency at cold temperature. It's a refrigerant-based system. As the temperature becomes colder, you lose density in your refrigerant and you lose performance. So Denso has been working on some innovations in this area. One is our compact gas liquid separator, which is doing efficiently pulling out high density vapor that then we're able to put back into our compressor with gas injection to increase the density of the refrigerant and give us the efficiency we need in order to keep the system functioning even at cold temp. Why is this important? Can't be a good engineering presentation without showing some math. So looking at the cost of range, if you will, for a D-sized SUV, comparing a traditional vehicle to an e-vehicle, 79 times more expensive per range for a BEV. So we need to find ways to offset that. And looking at some data from a DOE study and doing some simple math, we can see that through the addition of a Denso heat pump system, in this case, we can see about a 9-mile range improvement. If we do the math back through this, then we're looking at $370 worth of value back to the car. But this is an example I wanted to show of how we can use our overall system understanding to benefit the customers as we try to navigate the transition. So that's the end of what I have prepared. Might be a little bit fast, Bruce, but to wrap up, I did want to reiterate our commitment to our vision for a carbon neutral society and also our commitment to supporting our customers as we navigate the transition to EVs together. That's the end of what I have prepared, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dan. As usual, it's always fun to hear a presentation from a Japanese supplier, Japanese manufacturer, when they start talking about the totality of looking at a system. And when and you're talking about carbon neutrality across the company, And this is something that I've always enjoyed understanding and learning about from Japanese companies in general, that there's really this methodology of really looking at the total system and looking for improvements throughout that system. And it's fascinating, when we've studied the Japanese companies in the past, the enthusiasm that we've seen within those companies as they would. I remember going to a Toyota plant in Japan and being the lead supervisor, showing off some minor thing that one of his workers had figured out, a line worker had figured out, and how to improve something, and the reward system that was part of that, and that if they would get a reward, and I think it's usually a financial reward that would show up at the plant, if that same kind of fix or change was instituted throughout the country and then throughout the world, they actually got more money. So it was a fascinating story. It always has been, and I'm sure it hasn't gone away. And it's a continuous improvement world, right? I really like the story about the hybrids and the continuing costs. And I wanted to ask you about this. You guys have been working on hybrids for a long time now, and yet the cost of the vehicle is still more expensive than an ICE vehicle. Why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah,
I think it was mentioned earlier, right? There's more content, right? So we've got double the system, if you will, that we have to offset somehow, right?
Right. And I know it's one of the GM quotes, right? We're not going to build two systems anymore, and then that was one of their reasoning for getting out of hybrids.
Yep.
But the reason I say that and I bring that up, and it kind of fits into the continuous improvement story. Usually, the continuous improvement is usually continuous cost improvement as well. So, is it that the hybrids have become that the savings that you've accrued over time have gone into improving the technology as opposed to reducing the cost? The cost has stayed the same, right? As opposed to increasing. The cost improvements have gone into improving the technology? I
think so, right? I mean, we're under constant challenges from our customers to improve the cost effectiveness of all of our components, right?
Right.
I think, when Denso is a Japanese company, but, we have significant business with the North American OEMs as well. And the key to us being successful is the balance, right? So we have to have the hybrid system, as you mentioned, to support our, Toyota, our largest customer. But at the same time, we still have significant content with Ford and GM, for example, and their approach is a little bit different. So we're working on optimizing in all of those areas, so that we're, as you mentioned, our thought process is a system approach. How do we work closely with the customer to understand what the system actually needs, and then provide them the most cost-effective system that we can.
Now the PHEV story, it was, and we spoke about this a little bit yesterday in our discussion. Some recent research that's come out of I think came out of Europe, that talked about how drivers were not plugging in their PHEVs, and that they were driving an engine that was not optimized to be driven by itself, and that it was less efficient and more polluting than just a good ICE vehicle by itself. Are you guys working on anything that would, trigger customers so that they would actually, plug in when they should be plugging in? It's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm on the powertrain side, so I don't have a whole lot of exposure as far as what we're doing with the driver communication stuff. But I can tell you that we've studied that same thing extensively, right? And there are significant issues from an emissions point of view with a hybrid, right? If you're operating it as you mentioned, right? So
Right.
I think that is a challenge that does have to be overcome. I think there's options for it, right? It can be done passively or actively. It becomes a cost balance, right?
Mohammed or Amaya, have you guys been discussing this issue in your companies?
In general, I want to comment and second what Dan said. This is something that the OEMs usually have let's say, the leading role. In our house with my partner, I always discuss, she's a psychologist, and I talk to her understanding how we can do it. And some of the features that could be quite intuitive, as an engineer, we overthink sometimes. And because of that overthinking, we overcomplicate, and then solution becomes very difficult or expensive. And she sometimes says that you need to tell me what I need to do sometimes. And it's as simple as some of the vehicles have the dash indicators that change color depending on your aggressive driving, stuff that is fairly intuitive. You don't need a PhD in mechanical engineering to understand it, can have an impact. But as you mentioned, PHEV success story will be dependent on the rate of plugging in. If you think about the recent PHEVs that are being introduced, they are offering ranges that are within the daily average range of commuting in the United States. So theoretically, majority of the trips can be done in the EV mode. But the obstacle here is that if you do not plug in, you have depending on your battery size, you have a 500 to 750, 800 pounds of extra weight that you're carrying every single mile that you are not driving it according to the specifications.
Amaya, do you have anything to add on this?
Not much. I haven't thought much about that, but I think I have an easy solution. Maybe your garage door doesn't open unless you easy now. No.
Right. I mean, it could be as simple as that, right?
No, but I do have a similar thing on the IC side, which is this electrically heated catalyst, which is there's a few conferences where I've seen this idea that how about preheating the catalyst before, so to get it hot soon and low emissions. And I also wonder about how that would work in terms of, there has to be some sort of trigger where we say, okay, we're going to drive, and then it has, even 10 or 30 seconds could be enough to get that warming process started. But again, there have to be some sort of triggers, and I agree, we probably are overthinking this. There are easier ways to do it, but doesn't come to mind. I wanted to make one quick comment on your previous question on the hybrids, which is that often hybrids are also certified to a higher level of emission norms, right? So like a Prius would be SULAB 30 compliant versus another vehicle may not be. So there's also a little more content, more precious metals, and precious metals are crazy expensive today. So often the story is a little complicated. Like Dan was saying, there's of course more sort of content on it, etc. But then there's also that they are in a different class slightly, so that they tend to be more expensive.
Yeah. Dan, when you look at the strategy for the Japanese, has always been, and we're talking since what, the 1990s, the focus has been the future of fuel cells for passenger cars, and they are, and those vehicles are sold. The Clarity, the Mirai are sold in California, and I think only in California. But they're available and they work. What do you see for the next probably 5-10 years for fuel cells and passenger cars?
Well, I mentioned before that my crystal ball is broken.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure on that. I think that we see a pretty clear application for the fuel cell for the heavy duty side.
Yeah.
Right. Toyota's been running the experiment at the Port of Los Angeles for a while now. with their Mirai cells, and I think that one makes some sense, right? I think that with the fuel cell for passenger cars, you have the double issue of not only the development and the cost side of it, but then it's an additional infrastructure issue as well, right? So as we're fighting the EV infrastructure issue, we also need something for hydrogen as well.
Yeah.
So I think at least in the short term, it makes much more sense for a controlled fleet, right? Like that port application in Los Angeles is a perfect application. You have a truck that is going back and forth in a controlled pattern every day. You can have your own refueling setup, and it's very easy to manage and to optimize. So I suspect that's more like what we would see in the next 5 to 10 years.
And the Japanese government has always been very supportive of fuel cells right from the get-go. And whenever I read the Japanese papers, they're still very strongly supportive of that. Of course, Japan as a country has to import so much fuel. And they don't have natural resources for fuel, so they're always looking for ways of trying to improve this, right?
And Mohammed mentioned earlier as well, right? The socioeconomic impacts are there too, right? So the Japan culture is employment for life. So how do we keep all of these folks employed that have been building ICE engines for all these years, right? What type of work can we create for them? How do we keep those plants running and keep the economy going, right? So I think that's part of it as well.
Okay. Amaya?
No, I was just going to say there's so much regional decision making as well, again, in all of this. And I think I remember seeing that perhaps China is also now pushing more on fuel cell side as well, especially on buses. And I was surprised because it was like, okay, they are the first to show that an entire fleet of bus can be made electric. So why now move to fuel cells? And I'm not sure, but perhaps it has to do with they have a lot of methanol, which could then be converted to hydrogen. So there are these fuel, considerations which also come into place. So there's, again, different strategies, I guess, that would play out. But I completely agree with Dan in terms of the infrastructure challenges and all of that makes fuel cells very difficult to compete on the light duty side in the near term anyway.
Well, Dan, we can't let you go without making a comment about air mobility on your first air mobility slide of your career, right?
Yeah.
Now,
and
is that really just an EV in the air?
Fundamentally, yeah, right. It's the air taxi market, right? And all of or I shouldn't say all, but lots of the OEMs have been advertising that as well, right? But it's an ideal opportunity for Denso. We have a robust system for the EV motor and that sort of thing, and we bring highly capable production facilities to that market. So it's just getting started now. And, I grew up building model planes, and, to have a slide with one of those on it is pretty exciting. So.
Now, the cost of range slide I thought was very interesting. And here I'm assuming you're dividing the range by the MSRP.
The range by
the how are you getting the cost? How are you coming out with a
cost? Was based on the cost. Let me jump back. It was based on, actually the cost was based on energy and storage. So not necessarily MSRP, but to generate and then store the energy on vehicle. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. I was wondering if it was similar to the analysis that we showed yesterday that talked about the or divided the MSRP by the range of the vehicle and got a ratio of how much a consumer is paying per kilometer for range. But I think this is another way of looking at it. This will be maybe another way for us to look at some of the issues in comparing EVs across regions.
Yeah, this was put together by some of our thermal folks. I'd be happy to make the connection on that, Bruce, if we want to talk about that.
Okay, very good.
Yep.
Let's see, we have a question here. Hybrids. I guess actually, this is for everybody in the panel. Can you talk about specific ways that hybrids improve criteria emissions? I guess, Amaya, that's probably something that you were probably discussing in your presentation, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the data is quite conflicted, but at the very core, again, if hybrids consume 20 to 30% less fuel, right there, you have a reduction, right? And you're just burning low fuel, so you're emitting less pollutants. I would say then, in urban conditions, you could have the engine turned off for whenever you're stopped, and all of that, those benefits add up, right? Incrementally, you're just not emitting as much PM and NOx during those phases. On the other side, and there's been some research done in the past few years which show that, well, whenever the engine comes on, you have the spike of NOx and particulates, which is also not good. So on the balance, I would say, yes, they are an improvement over ICs, but there's more work to be done, I would say, on the control side. And it is being done, by the way. There have been some excellent papers in the past couple of years which show that, yes, you can make sure that, the engine comes on before the after-treatment system gets really cool and so on. So there's much work being done. But again, at the core, it's just there's burning less fuel, I would say.
I want to add one more point.
Sure.
In addition to the thermal management of the after-treatment system, having the optimization of the ICE with the let's say rapid and responsive and transient hybrid system that they can eliminate some of the transients is going to be the solution. ICE is very efficient when it is steady state because you can calibrate, you can dial in all the parameters to optimize your operation. What is the issue is when you have the transient. And if you can eliminate the transients by a good responsive electric propulsion and have your ICE run in the sweet spot for majority of the operation, that will have not only benefits in the CO2, but significant benefits in the criteria pollutants as well.
Okay.
I mean, if you see Nissan recently, they have this 50% brake thermal efficiency. I think that goes to the point Momo is making. I mean, the dedicated hybrids as they are known, right? So you're really using the IC only in its real sweet spot and then letting the electric motor do the rest of the work.
Dan, here's a question for you about the e-axles. How much growth do you see for e-axles in the US? What peak power and speed for the motor can you expect in the US market?
I'm gonna have to pass on that one.
Okay.
I don't have a lot of background with that. Sorry.
Okay. I thought you were mentioning that in your, did you mention the e-axles? Oh, it was
my presentation.
Mohammed, you were talking about the e-axles.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't have all of the numbers in front of me, but what I can say that with the modular design and case-specific design that we said, we have e-axles from the compact class vehicles starting with 70 or 80 kilowatts all the way to 350 kilowatts per axle that are being integrated into the commercial vehicles. In terms of the speed, again, it depends on the use case. So you need to match your gear ratios with the demand that you have from your powertrain, but there is a wide spectrum. And what we are doing is that we want to ensure that the efficiency of the electric motor as well as the inverter as a system is optimized with the proper gear ratio so that for most of the operation of the vehicle, you are at the higher efficiency. And I had in the slides the 96% system efficiency that we have with our e-axle is basically taking consideration to the whole complete package, power electronics, e-motor, as well as the gearbox and gear ratios.
Yeah, I'm always amazed and never surprised anymore. But is if you give the industry a challenge, the engineers will figure it out. It may take a little more time, and it may be a little depending on cost challenges, right? The engineers will figure it out. One of the things I wanted to close with today was the results from the survey when we were talking about the transition to electric vehicles, and they were talking about 10% EVs in US by 2025, 23% by 2030. Do these seem like reasonable numbers to you? Amaya, I'd like to start with you.
So 10% by, you said
2025 and 23% by 2030.
in the US overall, that seems challenging. The 10%, the next number maybe, but the first one seems a little ambitious, just because, I mean, yeah, that's 4 years from now, and it's other than California, we're seeing very slow sales in EVs. So the CO2, the regulations will really trigger the next round, but it's still, it is yet to kick in after model year 26. So
Dan, how about you?
What was the percentage you said?
10% for 2025 and 23% by 2030.
Yeah, I would agree with Amaya. I think the first number is a little aggressive. The 23 for 2030 is maybe closer. I say it depends on which source and which day that you look into, right? But I think, that's in the range that we're thinking about as we're trying to do our planning. But it's the knee in the curve, right? Like I talked about on my first slide, where that knee has been sliding for the last 5 years or more, right? Where it's where you keep waiting for that tick up to come, right? I think once it comes, then we're going to get to those numbers pretty fast. But it's a question of when that is really going to kick in, right?
Yeah. Mohammed, how about you?
My crystal ball is also broken. I need to take it to the same shop that Dan will take. Is nothing to add. I agree, concur.
Yeah, the last year when we asked that question, it was I think 6% for 2025 and 14% for 2030. And as you know, so many announcements just occurred over the last year that. And actually announcements as well as introductions. I don't think the Mach-E was out yet. The Rivian vehicle wasn't out yet, and I'm not sure if it is out yet. But and the Lightning wasn't out yet. So I think there were announcements that the Ford F-150 was going to be out. These kinds of announcements. But I think it obviously has an effect on people. When they see that. Especially when we see vehicles coming in different segments that they were not in before. Compact SUVs, the pickup trucks, especially in the US. If you have vehicles in these segments that are the most popular segments in the US, and compact SUVs is the most popular segment in the world. If you have vehicles in these segments, I think the ID4 fits into that category. You see that there's potential for a more uptake but if you don't have vehicles in those segments, it seems like it's a more difficult challenge. And I guess I want to follow up with that. And we talked a little bit about this earlier before the conference. When would we be where we are today if Tesla had not existed? Did not exist. Dan, what do you think?
I've been thinking about that question since you brought it up earlier, and I'm still not quite sure how I want to answer it. But I think the biggest portion of that is the outside influences. I think have helped change how the OEMs work, right? Where it's a bit like the work from home thing, right? Where we really didn't think we could do it until we had to do it. And we've actually been doing it pretty well, right? And Tesla and some of the others have shown the OEMs that it really is possible to go faster, right? And based on that, I think that's changed the industry significantly, right? Where the OEMs have really taken that as an example of, we really do need to speed up our activities, right? One of the other colleagues earlier mentioned about a conservative auto industry, right? And we tend to move very carefully, very safely. And Tesla has shown that you can move faster, right? And I think that's probably, from my point of view, that's the most impact it's had.
Okay. Amaya?
Yeah, I don't think we would have been here without Tesla taking the lead, clearly. I mean, I think, yes, other companies would have, and eventually, depending on the pressures on climate change, we would have had, again, I don't think electric vehicles per se are new, right? We know they've been around for decades. I mean, the technology could have been developed someplace else as well. But to Dan's point, I think it is the pace that Tesla showed that it can be achieved. I mean, I think, even look at the gigafactories, like they've done this bottoms up, showing that yes, we can, no kidding, build, hundreds of gigawatt hours of batteries in one place, and we can do all of this. I think that was pretty cool. But so had they not done it, I think it's like this chicken and egg, right? Like policymakers would have said, no way we're going to have like everything electrified, so let's look at other options. And whereas, so yeah, I think they certainly did sort of ignite this industry. But
Mohammed?
I agree with all said. What I want to add in addition to all of that, good timing, good business models that they could also benefit and take advantage of the regulatory and incentives that were in the previous administration, both in the seeding like investment area after the recession in the 2009 and 10 timeframe, but also with all of the credit systems and the BEV multiplier credit systems that basically kept the cash flow. And it's a business model. Last year, they had 1.4 billion, and this year they are projected for $2 billion revenue from just the CO2 credits. So that's a chunk of money that can make a difference, but nothing to be taken away from that let's say, and on like characteristic risk-taking approach that the company brought in, and they showed and showcased that if you have the cool product, the customer will even tolerate some of the imperfections in the short term.
Exactly. Very good. Thank you very much, all of you. It's been a great discussion. I really enjoyed the time we spent together discussing this, and I think you brought some really good industry insight. And it was a nice balance between yesterday and today, where we're really talking the kind of the non-industry issues, and today the industry issues related to the transition to EVs. Thank you very much. I appreciate you, the time that you've taken out with us today. To close, I just wanted to focus on, again, thanking our affiliates for supporting us through their support for our programs. The conference website will have the presentations available. We're planning on having that this weekend. The videos will be up for both days, hopefully this weekend as well. Our next conference, we're going to look at a little even more challenging technology, the autonomous vehicle, and want to get an update about where we are in terms of development for autonomous vehicles. The Meet the Speakers program, I think a couple of our speakers are going to be meeting with some people after the conference. If you have a second, if you have some time, you would want to join that, you can click on that link that was in the YouTube description, but also in the email I sent you. And I think that's it. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you in September. Take care.
thank you.
Thank you.